Good evening. It's Tuesday evening here. Welcome back to Pump Up the Volume. My name is Luis Daniel Muñoz, a medical doctor, technologist, also previous independent gubernatorial candidate in the state of Rhode Island, and someone who, again, is always trying to really challenge the establishments in Rhode Island because they always seem to forget about the rest of us. I'm joined today by two out of my three fellow co-hosts, and so I'll leave the last introduction, who's not here for the end, but start with Mr. Scott Rotundo from WBOB 990, coming to you live every week on that online independent media channel. So please check him out. Also, Scott's background has always been to not only do the same in terms of challenging the status quo, but also really bringing political leaders across the political spectrum into a safe space where you can have an open discussion around what their solutions are and how practical or not those solutions might be. And certainly coming from the city of Pawtucket, where I currently am, there are two of us representing today. We also have Mr. Pat Ford, co-founder of the Libertarian Party here in the state of Rhode Island, and he will make that clear time and time again in our discussions. And also the founder of the Coalition Radio Network, the medium through which we are streaming. And so grateful to have my fellow co-host here. We do not have today Mr. Bill Bartholomew on the show, but Bill, we miss you. And Bill's out there doing big things with different, obviously, TV shows and appearances on various mediums. And I guess that's what you get when you're out there on the front lines all the time, bringing people the latest news. So we wish Bill happy Tuesday, and we'll see him hopefully in a week or two once things settle down for him. So what do we do here on Pump Up the Volume? Well, really what we try to do is pump up the volume, amplify many of the questions that are arising at the community level, which may not always be reaching the administration, both the outgoing administration and incoming administration. And unfortunately, in that transition, we've seen some consistent themes, which seem to be that, a top-down approach, right? Call it Rhode Islandonomics, whatever new phrase you want to invent. But the fact is, we're not seeing much in the way of change. But before we get into Rhode Island politics, which we tend to obviously focus most of our time on, why don't we talk a little bit about the national, what's going on the national stage now? And for that, I think, Scott, it would be great to have you lead off on what you've seen over the past week and what our listeners should know more about.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad to do it. Keeping an eye on the national scene, as you mentioned, something that seems to be picking up some steam in the nascent, birthing of the Biden administration, if you will, is student debt. Right now, I agree that student debt is a huge problem. I believe it's a $1.7 trillion problem right now. To put it in comparison, when I graduated back in the late 90s with my MBA, all in undergraduate and graduate degree, I want to say I was about $19,000 in debt. And I was like, holy smokes, how am I going to pay this back? I'm going to need 3 jobs to pay this back. How am I going to do that? When you look at it today, I mean, you can go $19,000 in debt per semester. One of my relatives, she graduated college about 5 or 6 years ago, and she's still 6 figures in debt. And this hampers, your ability to buy a home, to buy a car, to really establish yourself. So starting out behind the 8 ball. And there's kind of the ball rolling out to forgive, as I mentioned, up to $50,000 of debt per student. On the one hand, you say, great, that would alleviate that burden. And believe me, even though I'm a financial professional, I have no love for big banks. I think they're predatory and charge confiscatory interest rates sometimes. But let's think about what would happen. Let's say next week, President Biden, with a stroke of the pen, does away with, you fill in the amount, 10,000, 20, 50, heck, let's make it $100,000 of student debt per person. What happens then is the banks have a big loss. And if you think for 1 minute, the banks are going to just take that loss and sit on it, you got another thing coming. The bank's always going to win. And as I said, I'm not a proponent of the big banks. What's going to happen is they just will have less money available to lend. So now these same people who had their student debt wiped out and want to go buy a car or buy a house won't have the funds available to them. Or they'll recover their loss through even higher interest rates. So it kind of takes the problem and it just kind of comes at it from a different angle. You see, I don't really know what that solves. I'd actually done a written piece for WBOB about a year or two ago. My solution to the student debt crisis would be not canceling the loans, but do away with the interest. They shouldn't be making money off these kids' educations. And also, to the extent that these universities are getting federal funds, tie the tuition increases to inflation. There is no reason on God's earth why tuition, my daughter is going to be a freshman in college this fall, why tuition should go up 10% a year if inflation is going up 3%. Unless you're buying a Hadron Collider every year, there's no reason. And if you do that, it'll by extension keep the costs lower and make college more affordable. It's just kind of my 2 cents and how I would go about tackling the problem as opposed to just shifting the burden from student debt holders to really everybody.
So, I totally see where you're coming from, Scott, in terms of like working within the confines of the system and the rules that exist, right? And then also the secondary step, which is how do you control the rising cost of tuition, which we're seeing rising cost everywhere, right? In every industry.
Yeah.
So those being two, if we can separate them for a moment and say like, how do what is debt forgiveness? What does it look like if it can even happen now? I mean,
Mhm.
I've thought a lot about this from a legal standpoint, right? I mean, universities, colleges market themselves as being a pipeline to jobs. They sell
Mhm.
themselves, that's their value proposition, and yet they do not create pipelines for the very degrees and programs that they're creating. And so what I mean by that is I think it's easy for people to draw a quick judgment and say, well, what did you think you were going to get as a philosophy major? Now, having been a philosophy major that eventually went to med school, the fact is you can do things with philosophy, you can grow from there, but you need to be in an institution that creates that pathway, right? That for that inflection point, whatever it may be. And I feel like our universities and colleges, Ivy League and even state, have really neglected that responsibility in a serious way. And they may have pipelines for the science, careers in STEM, but I don't really think there's been a proactive effort to bridge the divide that we see with, jobless graduates coming out of the humanities. And so when I look
Mhm.
at forgiveness, I think we can take the humanistic approach, which is forgive the debt that some of these individuals will not be able to pay off within 20, 25 years, which by the time they reach that point with 2025, when they can possibly have it forgiven legally, it's now they're in a situation where their whole lives have passed them by, right?
Mhm.
So if we're not going to forgive the debt, then we should give them the instruments to sue these universities and colleges and have the universities and colleges eat the debt. Because again,
Sure.
this is a contract that was agreed upon. And I
Yeah.
mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because I mean, justice. We need some level of justice here. It doesn't seem
No,
right that you lie to someone
I
they're
really
going to
like
have a
what you
job.
said. I really like the way that you looked at it. I could get behind that because, I mean, to your point, you're right. You say to a kid who graduated with a, like you said, philosophy major or, English major, well, what did you expect? Well, I would say you're right. It is a contract between the university and the individual, and there should be an actual proper, career center at these universities too. When I went to URI and my alma mater for undergrad, the University of Maine, the Career Center was basically a poster board with business cards tacked to it. So that was the extent that you got help, to know, okay, I'm getting this degree in whatever. What are some jobs that I can expect, to get off to be able to pay back the costs I'm incurring? So you're right. To the extent that hasn't been done, the university broke its half of the contract, and I could absolutely get behind those kids suing the university, and yeah, have the university instead of government or the rest of the taxpayers have to eat it. Sure.
I have this
But
mental
there's a
image.
consequence of that, right? Oh, sorry, Pat. But
Mhm.
Pat, before you go, but Scott, the bank will eventually eat that debt too in some other form, right? If the university eats it.
It, it will, yeah, but at least we can delay that a little. The bank's always going to win somehow. It's just unfortunately it's the fact of life. It's like the
But that's
casino.
a
The house always.
but I guess that's the point here too, right? The point is like we developed a system that will suffer a hit. And the question is, what's the
Right.
mechanism that we want to use for that? And what's right and what's wrong, right? And so
Yeah.
I think when we look at all student debt, um, I think it's fair to say that there's a nuanced approach. Like there's, that some people who have professional degrees are more likely to get employment and jobs that could pay off the debt. And there are many others who have degrees where they will not be able to. And
Right.
unless we get into that level of like detail and nuance, it's going to be hard not to run into this concern, right? Which is, well, how will the rest of the world, how will the general overall economy be impacted by this? Anyway, but yeah, this is going to be like another. We need to carry this to next week, so let's bring it
Yeah,
back to.
with me. Yeah.
Could I just interject one brief statement? In related
No,
news,
it's a long statement. Yeah.
in related news, the heavy hitter has announced that he is going to institute a practice of litigation against area universities. So I forget the song. Maybe Scott, you can sing the heavy hitter song. Either that or Sparks Law.
Oh,
What
I
do you
don't think anybody wants me to sing.
So ambulance chasing will come to a whole new level. But I digress, gentlemen.
So
Carry
what,
forward.
what do you think, Pat? I mean, from a libertarian perspective, right? When I say libertarian perspective, not just like a moderate libertarian, from someone who is like 100% there.
Radicalized.
What I mean, well, yeah, like from your perspective, what is it, what is the mechanism, or should we just altogether, people should just pay their debt? I mean, I'm just interested in getting your perspective. Like, where do you fall on this?
Well, I mean, there is a whole school. There is a gentleman who used to be here in the Pawtucket area who used to do some stuff with me in terms of media, and we came up with the Pat Ford conundrum, which says I'm in favor of all taxes I don't have to pay, which drives people insane. All right, Scott, you remember that? For example, when it came to raising taxes on Brown University and RISD, there was a moment in time when that was a hot topic, and I pointed out that in a sense I'm conflicted. If in fact my then teenage daughter attended an area private university, then of course I would be opposed to said tax because it would be a terrible idea. It would be a terrible infliction upon the not-for-profit sector, and clearly unaware of the financial contribution that area universities make to Rhode Island. Of course, if my child chose to go out of state, I'm outraged, in fact, that the area universities are able to get such a free ride. So purely from a statement of personal bias as the father of two daughters who have some college debt, I'm all in favor of removing it. But seriously, folks, A, what about the moral hazard? B, no one made them take on this debt. They just didn't. It's... What about?
I think we're going to start a little bit of a debate now. So
well, I've been
right.
uncharacteristically quiet here, so I just want to throw in that if in fact we eliminate any moral hazard to bad decisions, then there are no such things as bad decisions. It's an oversimplification, but at what point in time do people take any responsibility for those decisions? And, and what about the people who paid their way? There was that remarkable moment in the Joe Biden campaign. No, I'm sorry. It was the senior senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, who was confronted by an angry father who pointed out that he had paid for his daughters. He was a working man. He had paid for his daughter's tuition. And what about him? Does he get a check back? Does he get a refund? And there's an entirely valid point to that. There's an entire generation of people who laid out tens of thousands of dollars for their children's education and won't see a penny of that back under this program. I'm done.
Yeah, so I'm going to say something a little controversial here, and I'm just really going to acknowledge the fact that this is coming from a place of equity. Being one of 5 children with parents that did not go to college, that struggled with a lot of issues, one of them being financial, that were not together, where there were no role models. My understanding of what student debt meant as an undergrad really was not I didn't really have an understanding of that debt. I came into really an understanding of student debt in grad school, because that's ultimately, I had enough time in undergrad to see the debt build, and then I was now stepping into a medical graduate degree. Now, what pushed me through the daily fear of what it was to live with student debt was the fact that I wanted a life that was different, than my parents' life. I wanted a life for my eventual children, now my daughter, that would not have as much hunger and struggle. And so I'm bringing it to a human level because, yes, I understand what you're saying, Pat. Like, we all make decisions, but there are thousands, and I would venture to say hundreds of thousands of students out there that just want a better life. And the only way in is to take on this large amount of debt. When a Harvard University or Brown University accepts a student from the hood, and that student is not given a full scholarship, what does that student do? Do they turn down something that could completely transform their life and the generations that they'll produce, or do they take on the debt? And so, like, I actually think, I mean, you love to say, Pat, you always bring this word up, coercion, right? Like, what would these subtle coercion, like, how are you being forced? Are we being forced to pay taxes? Well, is that person being forced into the only path to opportunity that they have, which is in fact taking on a massive amount of debt?
Well, I mean, let me respond. First of all, as the father of two daughters, one who went to what one would acknowledge as sort of a art super school, and the other one went to an Ivy League university, I speak with some personal, personal, if you will, experience. And simultaneously, and not everyone can do this, and I understand very careful when I say this. It was through a series of fortunate circumstances in my life. Neither of my children ever attended a day of public school. So, A, I pay taxes for a school system that, I'll never see anything personal from. B, I had to put my children, if you will, through two very expensive universities in which there was a 2-year overlap. First of all, the notion that college, anytime you are given a product or something like an education that requires if you will, the labor of others, means there's no such thing as a right to an education. There isn't. We try to do the best we can as a society. Quite frankly, we do very poorly. We claim that everyone has a right to an education. And that, I believe, that whole sort of forced participation in it and the way it's managed has led to just, you talk about generations being, generations lost in space, if you will, without any opportunities. Quite frankly, it's the result of largely a public education, particularly in cities like Providence. But to the subject at hand, first of all, the notion that the only way to success is through a college education, I don't agree with at all.
But that's not what I said, Pat. I just want to be careful you're not reframing what I'm saying. I said that for some, it could be the path out.
Absolutely.
And out's a relative term, but for some, it is the path out.
Right. And to that degree, first off, I think a lot of folks will concur that the reason why education is so expensive is because we've made loans so easily available to people who want to borrow money to go to that type of education. So we are, there's inflation in the process. But just close off and saying, you know what? Again, we're creating a society where everyone gets to live off the shared efforts of the fewer and fewer. And there is a breaking point. There is that moment when Atlas will shrug and say, screw this. I'm working for everybody and anybody. You're using coercion to create, if you will, this false notion that everybody's entitled to something. And if the whole point of the debt is for people to make that one-time leap. And I don't know how you can pay for it without taking money from someone else, and that's wrong. The current situation stinks. I agree.
I want to go a step further, though, and say, kind of back to one of my earlier points, maybe young kids wouldn't have to take out the mountains of debt that they do right now if somewhere along the line these universities had been held in check as far as their tuition increases. Some of them, especially if you want to go to school out of state, it's ridiculous. I mean, you can see tuition increases of up to 10% every year. There's no justification for that. People don't get 10% raises every year. Inflation is not 10% every year. So I think that's another piece of the problem too. Because to your point and to Dr. Munoz's point, I mean, it's kind of I almost look at it like the housing bubble in the early 2000s. It was like every year inflation went up 3%, and at least around here, housing prices went up 20%. And I remember saying to my girlfriend at the time, one of two things has to happen. Everybody has to get huge raises, or the bubble needs to burst. How is that correction going to happen in education?
When people start to
Yeah,
default on
and
loans.
yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing, right? You're going to get a massive wave of defaults. And frankly, let's be honest, you're going to enslave those individuals to a credit score that is not going to allow them to do anything. And let's call it what it is. I mean, that is oppressive at this point. I mean, it is another instrument of oppression. And with that, I just want to go back and say, Pat, that I cannot agree with the idea that education, we can argue whether formal versus informal education, like I'm happy to capture the nuances, right, of what trades and vocations versus like the a PhD might mean in terms of what we should invest in and how we should invest in those. Fine, we can have that that type of discussion, but in general, we live in a nation that is an economic powerhouse, and there is no reason in this country that every child should not have access to a quality education. Every youth, every even young adult, every person that's retraining, whatever the age, that they should not have a quality access to a quality education. If we're an organism, as this powerhouse of a nation, if we're an organism in this world, like its parts need to function, right, in a way where it can sustain itself. And having people with quality education, we can argue what that means, but having people who have access to quality education is essential. And we've seen historically what happens when societies do not make it easy for certain populations and communities to have adequate education, right? Those are usually oppressive, totalitarian, authoritarian regimens in the history of the world.
We've also seen what happens
so
when countries, nation states make it too easy, and the education effectively becomes worthless. In the sense that if you're looking at it from a sheer economics, I'm not debating that everyone shouldn't have a great education, and particularly given the amount of money we spend it. I'm just saying the entire mechanism which we provide to that is thoroughly failed. And to then say that we're going to give forgiveness on an entire generation's educational debt, when in fact it was their choice. Other people made choices based on the circumstances of the time. There are a lot of people who went to state universities because of the lower cost. They didn't go to private universities, and some of them got great educations. There's some wonderful state universities out there, all right? And there's some wonderful state universities that, like, for example, the University of Rhode Island, which rely almost all, take very little in terms of public funding. But understand that it was the government that decided that consumer debt educational debt and student loans were exempted from bankruptcy. It was the government that took over a lot of the mechanisms actually providing the student loans, and it was at that time that you saw the rates increase exponentially. It was the government that squeezed out outside participation in providing, if you will, onset student loans. It's so if you're going to then, as the government, say, do all of those things and then say, okay, we're going to have student loan forgiveness. If you want a new model going forward, too many people, paid a lot of their own way. Too many people made decisions based on economics of the time, not of the, okay, I'm going to see. There's too many times in this society right now where we make a decision which wasn't necessarily a good one, and then ask government to bail us out. And that goes from the credit union crisis on up through the education bubble on a local basis. It's too easy to make other people bail you out. It just is.
Okay, so yeah, but I want to address two things. First, yeah, URI only takes about 10%, right, in public funding.
Hmm.
But I mean, every time we're voting on a bond that's $100 million or more, they want to build out another building, right? So I
Hmm.
mean, where the dollars go also matters. On the other hand, I just want to go back, Pat. You're consistently saying on this show and on every forum that you have, the problem is you say the problem is government. You say tear it all down, start at scratch, and yet we are in fact talking about the same approach to student debt, right? We are saying tear it down, start from scratch, and you're disagreeing with that. So how does that approach and the economic consequences differ from your approach on
It, it,
tearing down government? Like
it,
how does it differ?
well, number one, it's very simple. First off, you're interjecting government into and impacting decisions that were made separate from the government. Again, you have people who went to state universities who didn't take on a lot of student debt who were accepted into private universities. How is it fair for them all of a sudden for everybody else to get bailed out? Number two, you're talking about people who worked inordinately hard. Dude, I drove a cab, literally. All right. So my kids could go to private college. All right. How is that fair to me? Should I have taken on more debt so I could get it wiped out? It's kind of like when someone picks up dinner at the dinner tab and you're like, damn, I should have ordered lobster. That's not fair. Everything about the
But
government.
isn't that the very sentiment that in theory libertarians are trying to overcome? Like, how do we reset anything? How do
You
and
don't.
I'm really
You don't.
well, Pat.
People made
Pat,
an arm's length decision to
what have you
take
been
money.
fighting for as a libertarian? What have you been fighting for then? I'm really trying to look at like the parallel here, Pat. It's hard for me not to see the parallel that you consistently say that we need a world that does not have government involved in people's lives, right? With
Right.
so much control. And
Right.
yet you are okay with saying that we should not forgive student debt, which is like embedded into the fabric at this point of our society,
Right.
oppressing.
But if the government is taking money, it's actually very straightforward. All of government's money comes from somebody else, and you have sort of a mob rule in this country as to who and how it's used, whether it be a soccer stadium locally or student debt nationally. So we take money using the force and the coercive power of government, and then we spend it. We reallocate other people's personal property. That's wrong. Once you've made an agreement to pay a loan, to take out a loan, and believe me, this is I'm living this. Not as badly as some, but I'm I'm living this. So once you've made a decision to take out a loan, somebody has to pay it off. So why should that somebody? I mean, you literally are potentially putting me in the position personally of having paid a lot of cash for my kids' college education that I had to work literally 3 jobs for, and then once I'm done with that, in what I'll call the full Rhode Island, if it was local, then you're asking me to work to pay other people's debt off because the money's got to come from somewhere.
But Pat, libertarians believe in charity, right? So this is a good thing.
Consensual.
This is a good thing.
No, when it's made with
All
consent.
all jokes aside, though, like that last part was a bit of a joke there, and I hope Pat. I hope you get it as take it as a joke.
The best for each of the rounds of this one. This is good.
So, but to throw it in your court, Scott. Like I really want to come back and challenge an element of what Pat just said. That we are all going to pay for that. I mean, look, we have the Federal Reserve, right? We have interest rates that are locked in. I mean, so low that at this point the debt is cheap. Are we really just basically from the moment a dollar is made to the moment an interest rates apply to it, are we really paying for it?
Well, I mean, I think we would at least indirectly, because I mean, think about it. Like, let's say you borrowed money from me, right? Or I borrowed money from Pat, or however, and then we just like refuse to pay the debt, right? So now that person's out the money. What's going to happen if someone else wants to borrow? That they're not going to have those funds available. I think also they'd probably get it back through, as I said before, interest rates, which, like you said, are historically low right now, but would be kind of forced artificially higher. Or if the government, as part of that, said, you know what, we'll print money to make up for it. Well, now it's inflation, so one way or another, it's gonna we'll pay for it somehow. Again, I come back to when I went to CCRI, I started at CCRI in 1990. I think it was $500 a semester. I'm not sure what it is now, but I know it's significantly more. My alma mater, the University of Maine, it was I think $11,000 a year for out-of-state tuition. 20 years later, it's like $11,000 a semester or more. How can that be?
Again, government, because of their it's just the never-ending tentacles, has allowed people to borrow money for college at a rate commensurate with their increases. Anyone who sells a product who can then get it financed will raise their prices. That's just a basic market philosophy. Because, if people are able to pay it off over time, they're much more likely to buy something that they couldn't afford. I've been guilty of it. It's just, it's human nature. Why do you think when you go to a car dealership, they break it down to payments? Because all of a sudden that $700 a month, it used to be $400, but that $700 a month sounds a lot more attractive, and you forget about the fact that you're buying a $45,000 car. Mm-hmm. Now, if the government said, you know what, on all our student loans, which we've been mercilessly ripping people off on with high rates, we were going to lower the rates to everybody. Again, there's some unfairness to people out there who already paid off the loan, but it's not a perfect world. But if the government lowered rates to everybody across the board, I kind of get that. But ultimately, so I paid for a product. The government paid for a product, if you will, through the student loan. The school got paid. The government's got to get paid back. The money has to come from somewhere. At a certain point, we can't just keep printing money. To Scott's point, people are wondering, hey, why is the price of my car? Why are all these things rising in price? Because people don't understand the impact of all this debt we're making and all this money we're printing on the value of the dollar. I mean, I just got a price sheet for I sell commercial trucks during the day. It's one of the gigs I got. All right. I just got a price sheet increase, which is staggering. An 8 to 10% surcharge because of the increase in raw materials. And part of that is tied into, this endless amount of money we're printing. There's costs to everything. It's just a question of whether you recognize them or not, or they're saw pedaled.
So,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I hear what you're saying, Pat. And look, across every industry, we can track those costs, those charges to distribution channels, to intermediary players, to who's doing the bidding, to political, to policy. Essentially, we can track it, right? We can see where it's coming from. My question, I guess, fundamentally to you is, and it's interesting because I think we've all been on the show. We all have heard various manifestations of libertarian theory, right, as it applies to policy, and you're enlightening us. But now, fundamentally, I'm trying to figure out, as an equivalent of a pure libertarian here, I mean, where does equity lie in your vision of the future, knowing that we have had a history that has really created significant prevalence of poverty, homelessness, and debt in historically disenfranchised communities? And so, how do those communities ever get out of it? And please don't say lift up yourself up by the bootstrap. Please give me the economic path out of it, because frankly, debt forgiveness, many people believe that is one step in that direction.
Well, if people simply lifted I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. If you constantly, let me put it this way, the best way to raise people up is to eliminate obstacles in their path. And I understand, if you will, legacy debt from bad decisions or a relative or anything, for whatever reason it was, didn't just have to be college, is clearly it's just sort of a ball and chain that goes with you forever. I can't make that go away. Nor can, if you look on the international level, debt forgiveness is a hot topic. It always has been. Everyone from Bono to the World Bank has talked about debt forgiveness. But by simply forgiving it, you're attacking the symptom, not the disease. On a national level, you look at countries who've generationally made terrible, terrible decisions, very often aided by organizations like the World Bank and IMF and organizations like that who just terrible decisions. But there's ultimately a cost. There's a moral hazard, and there's also a real financial cost to simply walking away from it.
But the disease is not. But the disease is not poverty. The disease is not hunger.
The disease is poor.
The
disease is governments getting involved in markets, engaging in the type of economic bullying, engaging in self-aggrandizement, engaging in theft, engaging in coercion. That's the disease, and it's evidenced by if you will, by countries whose, if you will, gross domestic product is hobbled by this generational debt. It's evidenced by students. Again, the Obama administration made decisions about student loans, to which we're paying for today, and of course they're not held accountable for it. But that's another conversation. If there's a central casting character in it, in any one of these crises, it's bad government. It was
right.
Organizations like the IMF should never have loaned money to corrupt regimes that they knew wouldn't invest in a manner as promised.
So Pat, and we're close to the end of the show just because of some late night work on the tech side that I have to do.
Absolutely.
But I want to give everyone 60 seconds, but I also want to just say, Pat, that I hear what you're saying, and I think Scott's heard what you're saying. We always hear what you're saying, but I know, just based on the work that you've done and the communities that you've advocated for, that you want people to get out of those prisons, right? They get out of that economic prison that they're in, and at the end of the day, the greed in men's hearts that are in positions of power may not be something we need to cure, but we can change the course of generations by making decisions. Now, we can talk about the mechanism, and earlier on, Scott, is it legal? Is it pure forgiveness? But at the end of the day, abusive pricing models should not be the fault of consumers. And it should not, it should not be something that an entire generation should have to bear. What I mean by generation is not the kids with debt now, but their kids who won't be first generation kids, who won't have those scholarships,
right?
Who now will have a parent that's trying to pay off their own debt, let alone work 2 or 3 jobs like you did, Pat, to pay off their children's debt, right?
Well, we're still paying
and just yeah. Well, it's just and I'm saying this, and this is not really a great ending to leave us off, but maybe we'll carry on next week. But it is hopefully an ending that leaves a lot of questions out there, because we have to do something. We can't just say that. Yeah. All right. So with that, Scott, 60 seconds, Pat, 60 seconds, and then we'll close out for this week.
So I'll go quick. I'll try not to even take up the whole 60 seconds. I am going to disagree with you, Dr. Muñoz. I think actually it was, this was good tonight, because you have 3 people with 3, I would say, very different approaches to what we all agree is a common problem. And we're just talking them out over here. And what's the right answer? It's probably some combination of what the 3 of us are talking about. And it did not degenerate into name calling, didn't degenerate into, whose suffering is more than another person. We talked about it as adults, and for that reason alone, I think it's great. It's proof that it can still happen. That 3, well-educated people who at least moderately like each other, right, but have different approaches to a problem, can get together and talk it out and come to some, even if it's not a mutual understanding, just some sort of agreement that something needs to be done. And that's what I got.
Thanks, Scott. Pat?
Well, I'm going to go with a governmental decision that ties, what a segue, that ties directly into my our debate here. I'm sitting idly by in last week's press opportunity with now governor in waiting, I call him, Lieutenant Dan, because he really is Lieutenant Dan McKee, and the Department of Health. And let's just say I've got a whole set of questions that I want to ask about an unrelated issue. And then I sit and, as we're doing a little casual web surfing, I read in the Providence Journal that the State of Rhode Island Commerce Corporation, in conjunction with Fortuitous Partners, has decided in the middle of a pandemic, at a time when the state is literally broken financially, in a moment in history when they have had forced closures of businesses that can only generate, in some cases, hundreds of dollars to, quote unquote, make up for 3 weeks of closed businesses, at a time when the debt in the state is skyrocketing, hard off the decision, if you will, by the Pawtucket Red Sox to not take the terrible package they were offered as a result directly of the public pressure that want nothing to do, not even one teeny tiny little bit, nothing to do with private funding for a stadium. So what do we do in the midst of a pandemic, which may in fact forever alter the ability to have in-person viewership of sports? We decide that as a government, we're going to spend $50 million and put some sort of stadium with some sort of upscale housing and retail, because God knows retail is a growth sector in the age of COVID plus the internet. And that's what we're going to do. And that's the type of crappy decision-making, idiotic decision-making that causes situations like we were just talking about. Terrible government policy. Terrible. And that's what we're going to do in the midst of all this calamity and all this chaos, because God knows the soccer games that take place 20 miles north at a facility that's far more advanced with a Major League Soccer team, their attendance dropped 9%. So this is the kind of problems that generate this legacy, this never-ending multi-generational legacy of debt and problems and hangovers and issues. That's what we have to stop now, doctor, so that 2 generations from now, or even the next generation, while the stadium isn't crumbled and we're still paying for it, that we can afford community health centers, and we can afford to take care of, if you will, of the least amongst us and the most marginalized. That's the food chain. That's the chain of violence. That's the economic racism. That's the trail of tears. That, if you will, is how we get to where we are now. So we need to look at the decisions we're making now, not just through the adult perspective of some idiot who's a loser 3-time mayor in a city like Pawtucket that he's brought to its heels. All right, we need to look at it through the perspective of the impact it's going to have, not just now, but on future generations. Or not. And we can continue and not learn our lessons.
Thanks, Pat. So that was a 5-minute take, Pat, and it was powerful. And I want to say I appreciate your bringing it all together. I mean, the truth is, that stadium and the decision that's been made, while some people may feel encouraged because they may benefit from it, it is concerning in a time where austerity measures might be around the corner, and that's where we're placing our dollars. To your point, Pat, given that we need community health infrastructure. So 100% with you there. For everyone joining us, thank you so much for joining us here on Pump Up the Volume, where we're amplifying again the questions and voices of community members. If you would like to share anything from your perspective with us, please feel free to comment on the video. Happy to bring you on the show, bring your questions into the show. And again, have a very open discussion here with individuals that think very differently, but again, have found a way to still have that love for one another, and again, all with the intention of fighting for people and communities that are often unheard. So thank you again. See you all next week. Hope you have a great evening.